Hello YouTube world, I graduated from college in December of 2021 and well, that means it's almost been 2 years since I graduated. Now I feel it's time to do a video review of my time in college. For your information, I attended the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas. My first day of class was on August 28th of 2017. And why does that matter? Well, there happened to be a solar eclipse that day. I'm not too superstitious of a person, but considering all the shit that has happened over the next 4 years, I'm kinda suspicious now and definitely going to watch what happens with my life when the next solar eclipse occurs. I know this video is about college, but I had plenty of experiences outside of college during my time in college. While I was jealous of students who got to study abroad in places like Europe or Asia, I had the privilege of visiting several locations during my college tenure. These included the Grand Canyon and by default Flagstaff, Arizona during spring break of 2018. Then I visited Colorado Springs during the fall of 2020, which included seeing the Garden of the Gods. Then I visited Las Cruces, New Mexico earlier during spring break of 2020. Right before the country shut down for the pandemic. Finally, in the summer of 2021, I took my first flight from Tucson, then did a layover in Denver International Airport, then finally landed in Kansas City. It was only supposed to be a 4-hour ordeal, but because of delays, that ordeal lasted 9 hours. And I could do an entire video over the topic, but I'm going to move on. A little fact about me, I love watching sports, and while in college, there were plenty of sports memories that will stay with me well after my graduation. First of which was KU making the Final Four in 2018. My friend and I went to Allen Fieldhouse to watch the game, and instead we got KU get slaughtered by Villanova 3-pointers, eventually helping Villanova make the finals and win it all that year. We didn't pay too much attention to KU football and their opponents, one of which happened to be Texas Tech each year. We'll talk about that a little later. KU football was not only bad, they were considered one of the worst programs in the 5 most powerful conferences in the country. Consider that this video was made in 2023, but the last time we beat our state rivals over in Manhattan was in 2008. During the 2010s, they also only averaged 2 wins a season, not ever winning more than 3 games in a season. In other words, the pure definition of a basketball school. So it's no surprise when watching the news recap, seeing quarterbacks torch the KU secondary, which when playing Texas Tech was none other than Patrick Mahomes. See, while other NFL teams were looking at powerhouses like Clemson, the Chiefs were in the plains of West Texas in Lubbock looking at Mahomes. Oh, and I can't forget this other memory that is truly a gem. KU going down to Austin, Texas and beating a Big 12 school on the road for the first time in 10 years. This had professors proclaiming that we are finally more than a basketball school and saying, "How about them Hawks?" This is why I gotta laugh a little living in Tucson when people complain about the local team, the Arizona Wildcats, being on a little bit of a skid. Oh, they haven't won on the road in a few weeks. And ironically, That final fall semester, KU would end up finding a diamond in the rough in the form of Lance Leipold. And the first 2 years out of college, KU football would have back-to-back 4-0 starts. I mean, the booth was never this full whenever I attended a game. My favorite pro team is, of course, the Kansas City Chiefs, who would make it to the Super Bowl for the first time in 50 years, making an epic comeback in the fourth quarter against the 49ers to ultimately beat them and get the second Lombardi Trophy in franchise history. Then me and a couple of friends decided to travel to Kansas City to experience the Super Bowl celebrations. And little did I know that would be the last large gathering event I would attend for over a year. Continuing with sports, KU hosted these pep rallies basically for their basketball team called Late Night at the Fog, which invited music artists such as Lil Yachty, 2 Chainz, Run DMC, and Snoop Dogg, which the Snoop Dogg concert was kind of controversial because apparently Snoop Dogg invited strippers to the concert, leading to this interesting press conference with Bill Self. KU's biggest rivals historically have been Mizzou, or better known as the Missouri Tigers, and then of course little brother from the Little Apple, Kansas State. And what fuels a rivalry better than a fight? KU and Missouri would not play each other for several years since Missouri decided to move to the SEC in 2011. However, both schools decided to play several games over the next few years while I was in college. While KU would win it all in 2022, 6 months after I graduated basically, they did play a portion of their championship season in the fall of 2021. I gotta say, one downside of attending a college of this size is having to deal with the weather while walking between the buildings to your next class. I specifically remember my first day of junior year in 2019 coming into class absolutely soaked. While this next event happened during the summer break, I did get to see my first Kansas tornado, and it didn't disappoint. And of course, having to deal with the seasonal temperature extremes. Summer really didn't bother me, it was winter that bothered me more, specifically the polar vortex of 2021. Classes were cancelled because the local utility, Evergy, was doing power cuts because the grid couldn't handle all of the houses in the region blowing all of their heaters at once. I did have a job while in college, at 2 jobs specifically. My first was at Entrematic, otherwise known as Amar Garage Doors, freshman year. I tried doing the whole full-time worker and student thing, and I only lasted a semester and a half. Shout out to all those people out there that have done that their entire college tenure. I really don't know how you could have done it. The biggest pro was the high wages paid a big portion of my tuition, leaving me with a significantly smaller debt burden compared to my peers. The con was I knew it was untenable and needed to switch to part-time work. Otherwise, it would start to really affect my grades negatively. In August of 2018, I started working at the Mass Street Dillon's location, and while I felt I could build a better career somewhere else, the schedule worked with my school schedule. And I have plenty of stories from my time there, but that could be made into an entirely different video, so I'm going to move on. Talking about my college tenure would be incomplete without mentioning COVID, totally disrupting my spring junior semester. And after hearing nightmare stories from my colleagues about virtual learning, I decided to take the fall of 2020 off. When it was announced several classes would return to physical learning, I resumed taking classes in the spring of 2021, and although it sucked not graduating that summer, I knew I ultimately made the best decision for myself. Attending the University of Kansas, there were numerous spots around the campus that I loved. This included the Kansas Union, which housed several restaurants that I would go to during lunch. My favorite, of course, was Chick-fil-A. They also managed to find the only mountain in Kansas, apparently, and built the university on top of it. This hill was known as Mount Oread, and walking from Jayhawk Boulevard down to Catfed Hall was no issue. But walking up was a totally different story. Going to school K through 12, I always seemed to have the misfortune of attending school in outdated, rundown facilities, only for the next class to enjoy new state-of-the-art facilities. However, I got lucky at KU when they built the state-of-the-art Capitol Federal Hall for the business school. I mean, this place just looked futuristic. Another building I often hung out in was Wesco Hall. They had this little place in front of it next to Jayhawk Boulevard called Wesco Beach, and that's where often you would find strange individuals with crowds surrounding them trying to spread their interesting ideologies or religious beliefs. But in Wesco Hall itself, there's this location that, if I remember correctly, was called the Underground. That's where I used to hang out in and eat on my lunch break. Maybe I needed something like papers or pencils for the next class, and they had a little store in there that I would go and buy those things in. Then there's this other place that I used to hang out in called Ritchie Hall. They had this hallway that just seemed really quiet. They had benches, and it was just really convenient for me to sit there and do my studies. This other location on the other side of Jayhawk Boulevard, there's the School of Social Welfare, and I used to also like to hang out there and do my studies because it was mostly quiet. And I gotta say, one of my favorite locations on campus was the historic Allen Field House, where the basketball team plays. This included a cool addition that showcased the history of the team, the national championship trophies, all their Big 12 championship trophies, and a wealthy alum bought the original rules of basketball, and that's housed there as well, along with a bronze statue of the inventor of the game itself, James Naismith, who, if you didn't know, also was the first basketball coach at the university. And interestingly enough, he is also ironically the only Kansas head coach to retire with a losing record. Now, of course, I had to take a lot of classes while in college, and my least favorite class was philosophy. I thought of the class as boring, like really boring. And I know I'm a business major, but I found out freshman year that I'm not cut out for accounting or finance. Statistics was by far the most difficult class I had to take. The only class in high school or college that I got less than a C in and had to retake. They just had this very boring professor who always seemed to go on tangents unrelated to the coursework, and it just made it very difficult for everyone to follow along. Also, it didn't help that the guy had a voice that, if I had trouble sleeping, I would think of his lectures and fall asleep. Any professor I didn't like, I immediately went to Rate My Professor to read the comments to confirm that I wasn't the only one not into them. Then during COVID, my communications professor, ironically, would have all of her lectures interrupted by her dog, and Yeah, the first time was funny and cute, but as the semester dragged on, it started to become more and more frustrating. I did enjoy attending class in Fraser Hall. It's kind of an iconic building on campus. You can see it driving into town and all around the city. I liked my Spanish professors and generally liked the content. I'm still a little frustrated that I was only like one class short of graduating with a Spanish minor, but long story short, the pandemic affected my studies and the business major was my priority, so I focused on that. I was willing to sacrifice not getting a Spanish minor in order to get my business major, basically. I remember on my first day of freshman year walking into class and seeing this Korean lady and thinking, oh wow, I'm here to learn Spanish, not Chinese. But it turned out she knew like 5 languages fluently and I was wrong to judge her, and I came to appreciate her insight and intelligence. Anyway, I liked learning about the different countries, their histories, their cultures, and even their politics. Speaking of which, I definitely could tell there's a difference politically between the Spanish and Portuguese department and the School of Business. It seems some of the Spanish professors would try to slip in leftist materials to try and make us good little Marxists. I specifically remember one of my Spanish professors making me and the class read this book about body hair on women and how it should be more acceptable. And that's how I will always remember that body hair in Spanish is vello corporal. Well, predictably, the School of Business was a little bit more in the center. I mean, they did try to push stuff like women empowerment, which no one should have an issue with in the whole LGBTQIA agenda. But they are also practical economically, like, no, Bernie Sanders, you will tank the economy if you tax corporations at 90%. Anyway, the one science class I took was geography, which was surprisingly interesting. Like, I felt they really opened my eyes on how the weather worked and why it is changing the way it is in the years since I graduated. In my last semester, I did like my professors, which involved taking 18 credit hours of marketing courses, or 6 classes. There was this really strict professor in marketing strategy who seemed to not like the other students because he felt they weren't serious enough. But for whatever reason, he liked me, and I was fine with that. Then there was this professor in services marketing that I thought was really funny because he was, and I genuinely felt he got me to get meaningful content out of his class. However, many students didn't like him because he had a strict no technology policy. Like, we're going back to the 1980s, folks. You're going to take all of your notes on notebook paper. KU, like every other school in this country, had its fair share of different student personalities, and I do not regret at all not joining Greek life, like, joining a fraternity. The business school felt like it was chock full of these bastards, 90% of which I couldn't stand. Sorry if you used to be involved in Greek life. I mean, there were the ones that contributed to team group activities and were actually nice people. But then there were some where I genuinely felt they only got there because of their parents' money. One night, sitting next to Budig Hall, a colleague and I noticed a bunch of pledges running by with no shirts on, with a bunch of writing on their backs. And in that moment, I knew I made the right decision, not getting involved in those cults/grape factories. On a side note, I remember this guy whose name was Jay Hawk. First name Jay, last name Hawk. I couldn't decide if it was cool or to feel sorry for him that his parents punished him like that. Then you had the foreign students who were primarily from East Asia or India. I'd say a good 75% of which made up the foreign student population. And I didn't have a problem with it, and I generally support immigration to our wonderful country. However, I do gotta admit that sometimes I couldn't help but look around and notice how many Asians there were around me. And there were plenty of out-of-state kids, most of which seemed to be from a few certain locations, including Chicago, Texas, specifically Houston and Dallas, St. Louis in Missouri, as well as Kansas City, Missouri, or KCMO. And of course the surrounding states like Colorado, Missouri, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. Then finally you had the country bumpkins, some of whom you could tell were the children of rich white landowners, had that thick country accent, boots, tight jeans regardless of gender. I really only know of maybe 2 or 3 other individuals from the Lawrence Douglas County area that I would regularly see on campus. The university definitely had plenty of tradition. On my first day, I was startled when I heard a loud whistle and smoke erupt out of the building in front of me as I was trying to find my way to class. Later, I learned that I was introduced to what was called the Big Tutor. Starting at 8 a.m., 15 minutes before the start of every hour, wherever you are in the town, you could hear this thing shatter the silence.
Big Tutor, as it's also called, is located on top of the power plant in the center of campus and can be heard for miles around.
You also knew your class was about to end when you heard it. They also had this saying, rock, chalk, jayhawk, which maybe it's surprising or maybe it's not hearing who invented it. Basically, during the 1890s, the university was trying to come up with a catchy chant until a geology professor came up with rock, chalk, jayhawk. There was also this clap that you would do during the school fight song, I'm a Jayhawk. However, it seemed no one actually knew how to clap properly to the rhythm. If you are wondering what I thought of the dormitories, well, I got news for you. I never lived on campus the 4.5 years I attended school there, and I do not have a problem at all with that. I mean, I saved so much money not living on campus, and I heard regardless of whatever institution you are attending, that the dorms are not the best part of the college experience. Instead, I either lived at my dad's mobile home. However, junior and sophomore year, I moved out and lived on Florida Street in this apartment complex. And then 2 years later, I moved out and I lived in this apartment complex on 24th Street behind the 23rd Street Dillons, while my dad rented out my room to various suspicious individuals. But eventually I decided to move back in senior year. He kicked those people out, and I lived there for almost another year before I decided to move down to Tucson. Anyway, that was my recap of my time at the University of Kansas. And still to this day, I'm kind of surprised but also proud that I ended up managing to get that business degree. As always, if you liked this content and this little story about a part of my life, like and subscribe. Thank you and have a fantastic day.